Hello, everybody. Welcome to you, and thank you for being with us this afternoon. Let me introduce myself. My name is Simona Lavagnini, and I'm moderating this panel. Let me introduce also my distinguished speakers today. Patrick Charnely, Director of Legal Policy and Licensing at IFPI, and Georgie Courtois, partner in the law firm in Paris, the Fleurance Associés. We will discuss together about artificial intelligence and copyright. Let me spend a few moments to introduce the speakers and the interesting discussion. I will start off by saying that we all know that artificial intelligence is causing a real revolution, which is likely to have a huge impact on our lives. Very much like previous industrial revolution, we already know, like the invention of the steam engines, passing through electricity, and then the more recent digital revolution. Now, I think that artificial intelligence will likely have an even broader impact on us, because it will not only change the way through which human beings work, but we will also probably change the way in which human beings understand themselves. After what we learned from Copernicus, that we do not live in the center of the universe, and after what we learned from Darwin, that we evolved from ancestors which were primates, now we learn that there are machines that we have created that indeed in some fields are superior to us, because they can process huge amount of data in a very short period of time and obtain results that are impossible for human beings. Just to think of the usual example used, which was the victory by the IBM artificial intelligence Deep Blue against the chess world champion Mr. Kasparov in 1996. And then we have a number of other examples of the same kind. So indeed we have to accept that there are some fields of knowledge, this kind of processing, of knowledge based on processing data, where machines will probably take the lead. Now, we want to focus today on another field, very important field of the human mind, which is creativity. Creativity is, of course, very much connected with copyright, arts, literature, music, indeed. But then also with another broad number of results of the human mind, like discoveries, inventions, idea, where, of course, the processing of data is very important, but there might be also something more. Now, the question is whether or not, and there is a space in this field, which space, at what condition? Because we know that artificial intelligence has already tested itself, or has been tested, depending on the point of view, in the field of creativity, so to say. We know that there has been this example of the collective obvious in France, in Paris, actually, where an artificial machine created a portrait in the style of the 14th, 18th century. And the result, one of the results actually, was called Comte de Bellamy, was sold by Christie's at more than 400,000 euros. We also know that there are examples in the music industry. There is this Dr. Thaler creativity machine, which I'm told produced in one single weekend more than 11,000 new music tracks. And also we hear about the fact that artificial intelligence can reproduce voices, for instance, can even create artificial voices that sound like human voices. And maybe could replace even human voices in terms of performing arts. Now the question here is whether artificial intelligence can really be creative in the sense that we have understood so far, or whether it can only diligently work on prior creations without coming up with something really new. And a second equally important problem, I think, is how we can cope with artificial intelligence in the very near future, even today. Because I think we have to bear in mind, on the one hand, that technology and history teaches us that technology cannot be stopped. On the other hand, we know that innovation can be very, and normally is very disruptive, but at the same time is also a great opportunity. So I think we need to try and understand how artificial intelligence can be dealt with to actually become an opportunity. And we will start from the analysis and approach of the music industry, as Patrick will explain to us in his speech. Please, Patrick, here's the ground to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simona. Hello, everyone. Buongiorno. It's a pleasure to be here. As Simona said, I'm working at IFPI. We represent the recording industry worldwide. We have some 8,000 record company members across our IFPI and our national groups operating in 70 countries. So we're truly global, and today we're talking about a global issue, one that sparked a lot of interest around the world. I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the recording industry, and then get into some of those questions that Simona has asked, and some of them a little bit beyond me, I think, from a technology level. But I think that we can probably all agree that although Deep Blue did beat Garry Kasparov in the chess, it didn't necessarily know that it did, and it didn't necessarily celebrate. And I think that probably tells us that AI, as has been said many times, can be very competent, but it is not yet conscious. So the recording industry. We are a global industry, and an industry that has completely transformed itself over the past couple of decades, from an industry dominated by the sale of CDs, which was the primary source of revenues, physical product, incorporating sound recordings, to a diverse digital music industry with multiple revenue streams. But the majority of the revenue, in fact, 63% of it, coming from digital. And can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. What we see here is how the innovation of the recording industry has returned the industry to growth after the years of decline that I'm sure everybody here will be familiar with, caused by piracy. We also see here the diversification of the industry, as the growth is driven predominantly now by streaming and innovations in the way that record companies get the music to the market. And in fact, record companies have licensed over 50 million tracks to hundreds of digital streaming services and other music services around the world, meaning that people have access to more music than they have ever had access to before. And I think that this success and the return to growth is testament to innovation in the music industry, in the digital music industry. And while the industry's return to growth is the good news story, of the industry globally, it's not the whole picture to say that this return to growth is simply innovation in the way that music is being distributed. What underpins this growth is the continued high level of investment that record companies make in artists and repertoire, and marketing artists and repertoire. And in fact, this continued throughout the period of decline, and record companies invest over 1/3 of their revenues back into A&R and marketing. And the point I'm making here is that professionally produced music and indeed other creative content doesn't just happen. It doesn't just appear at the press of a button. It requires huge financial and human investments. The process that is undertaken for an artist to come to market, for their music to come to market, requires massive investments by the record companies and by the artists, of course, themselves. And we need to bear that in mind when we're talking about the interaction between AI and copyright. Can I have the next slide, please? And I think it's also relevant just to mention in passing the very substantial contribution that the creative industries and the music industry in particular make to the broader economy. And what I'm showing here is a brief snapshot of a new report released this week, in fact, by Oxford Economics into the economic contribution of the music sector. I won't dwell on it, but I will just make simply the headline point that the music sector in the EU 27 and the UK contributes a headline of gross value added of 81.9 billion euros to the economy. That's very substantial. And again, this is relevant when we're considering copyright, when we're considering the interaction between AI and copyright, because it's that copyright framework that has underpinned much of that economic contribution. But now, on to the substance of our discussion, and if I could have the next slide, please. As mentioned, AI and IP and copyright is a global issue. There's a conversation ongoing at WIPO. I'm sure many people have joined that. There are consultations going on in the US, in the UK. The EU Commission published a white paper on AI, not on intellectual property, but on policy around AI. So this is very much the topic du jour, as it were. As often can be the case when a topic attracts a lot of attention, there can be, a sense that there must be regulation. We need regulation. At the same time, this is a very fast-moving area of technology, and it is really, really important that some of the issues that Simona raised and that we're discussing on this panel are considered very, very carefully and explored. So now let's look at AI in the context of music. And if I could have the next slide. AI is increasingly used to generate recordings and other output using existing recordings and works. Simona pointed to the example of 11,000 recordings being produced almost at the touch of a button, which is some might say it's exciting, some might say it's alarming, but it's a fact either way that this is happening. How does it happen? You have the input into an AI process. The input is existing recordings. They are ingested, protected recordings, and also, of course, the protected copyright works underlying that, the lyrics, the compositions. The existing recordings are reproduced and analyzed in the AI process, and then there is output that comes out the other end, and it may be, in the form of recordings. This gives rise to a number of issues. Obviously, there's intellectual property, there's copyright that we are talking about today. There are other legal implications, or there certainly may be. What are the implications for artists whose likenesses are used or whose styles are replicated in AI output? Not only deep fakes, which have had a lot of publicity, but in the style of an existing artist. Are there implications for that when the artist hasn't consented to that type of thing? And what might be the effect on human creators and digital markets if large volumes of recordings, that Simona referred to, and indeed I think you can have much larger volumes than that even, are released into the market and exploited commercially? What's the impact then on the recordings that are created in the more traditional way? And before going on, if I could just have the next slide, please. Sorry. Let's just touch on this one first. It's a practical example of a recent widely reported innovation in AI and music, which is OpenAI's jukebox tool. This is a tool whereby again, existing recordings are used, and they are ingested and in the style of recordings, or recordings not in the style of, but that are developed from learning from existing protected content, are produced and come out of the other end. We seem to have possibly gone back, but if I can just again remind you that for professionally produced recordings, the investment level is extremely high, with over a third of record companies' revenues coming from going back into the creation of new music, into artists, and the human investment, of course, of all the personnel in record companies, and needless to say, the artists themselves. So, if I could have the next slide, please. Question: how do you treat the use of existing protected works and subject matter in AI processes? And I would argue that the answer to this is very straightforward. Right holders should be able to determine how their rights are used. And it's highly relevant when considering this question that the quality of the output that we see on the right-hand side there is highly dependent upon the quality of the input. And as we are in Italy, or at least we are virtually in Italy, if I use a gastronomical example, a very, very talented chef can do wonders with very little. But I think everybody would agree that the quality of a dish is dependent upon the quality of the ingredients that go into it. And innovations in AI and development of AI and adequate protection of copyright in that sense are two sides of the same coin. They are entirely symbiotic. You want high level, high quality input in order to train the AI and to increase the quality of the output. You do not want training material that's of a lower quality, because it will have a direct impact on the output. And so what does that tell us? It tells us that we need to be very careful about anything that we do that would affect what we see on the left-hand side, which is the input side there. And if I could have the next slide, please. So progress in AI innovation and adequate copyright protection are not mutually exclusive. This is such an important point, because one of the issues in this whole discussion is, well, should there be new exceptions for copyright to enable innovation and AI? And I think that comes at this from completely the wrong angle, because AI innovation and copyright, will support each other. And then there are some more practical points here, which is that if an AI developer chooses to develop an AI that generates music, it has a number of options available to it. It can go to the market where there is copyright-free music, which may be, for example, recordings that are out of copyright protection, or musical works that are out of copyright protection, as its training material, as it's called. Equally, and absolutely crucially, it can approach right holders and it can seek licenses. And I think we've already seen, from the introduction to my section here, that the innovations that have happened in the recording industry are underpinned by the innovative licensing practices of right holders. Right holders embrace digital. We are a digital industry, and licensing should always be the first port of call, and there shouldn't be attempts to circumvent that, for example, through erosions of copyright protection. Surely it should not be the case that right holders are asked to subsidize the development of AI. And I think that we also need to think, in the longer term here. The rationale for copyright protection, for related rights protection, is to stimulate creativity and investments in creativity. We've seen the investments that are needed to create professionally produced content. Diminishing the protection of copyright reduces those incentives, and the reduction in the long run is a reduction in professionally produced content. So let's take a simple example of an AI that's designed to generate hip-hop recordings. it needs hip hop as its input. If it were the case that it could access all of the hip hop in the world for free, and analyze that, do what it does with it, and create hip hop output, what you see is a reduction in the incentive. If you end up with no hip hop because there's no incentive, there is nothing from which the machine can learn, and there is no hip hop output. And I appreciate that I'm taking an extreme example there of a complete suppression of innovation and no creations, no productions. But I do that just to illustrate the point that although things are rapidly moving, although this is a fast-moving topic of great interest, we do need to think long-term about the implications of policy that's being discussed today. And if I could just have the next slide, please. And a couple of other points that I would just like to make before I wrap up. And the first is liability and record keeping. I think probably liability rules around the world are adequate as they stand today to deal with who is liable for that type of ingestion, that type of use of works. But crucially, we need to make sure that AI doesn't provide a shield for infringement, that we don't end up in a situation where AI developers or operators are able to say, well, it wasn't me, it was the machine. These machines are ultimately not autonomous. A machine, and going back to your point, Simona, a machine acts within the terrain and within the parameters that are set for it. And we need to have that in mind when considering liability. And it might be worth considering record keeping obligations. It's extremely difficult to tell which recordings or the extent to which recordings have been used in certain AI processes, particularly if the output isn't in the style of the artist whose recordings have been inputted. So record keeping obligations would facilitate the settlement of infringement disputes and would also provide transparency in AI processes more generally. And then if I could just finally make a point again on transparency and the protection of creators and the protection of consumers and enabling consumers to make informed choices. An interesting discussion is around watermarking or other identifiers to let people know when an AI has been used to generate a recording, or alternatively, when it hasn't been used and the recording is truly a human one. So I will wrap up there. But all that said, the music industry is a digital industry. It has shown its growth on the back of innovation, and we find that innovation exciting, stimulating, and we see a great long-term relationship between digital innovation, but let's ensure that it's a balanced one, and that creativity and the protection of it doesn't need to suffer in the name of paving the way of other innovation. I don't see those two things as mutually exclusive. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I think that we will have time maybe later on before closing for a few questions on how creativity workers can imagine their future. But now I would like to go to Georgie, who could probably explain to us what are the options from a legal point of view that have been analyzed, especially from his privileged point of view, because he has been working for a commission in France who has been asked to think about a possible solution for the regulation of artificial intelligence. Please, Georgie.
Thank you, Simona, and thank you, Patrick, for your presentation. First, before going into my field of competence, I would like maybe to just say that I totally agree with Patrick and his analysis, and I am obliged, in fact, as a lawyer, to react and to say that the real problem here is the problem of input, output. I totally agree. But the real big problem and big threat with artificial intelligence is probably the fact that artificial intelligence is a black box for now. And there is, as Patrick mentioned, a matter of transparency. So Patrick proposed to have like a label to say whether it's not an AI creation, and that's very good proposal, I think. But if you put yourself as a lawyer and thinking about infringement, the real problem is that it will be really, really difficult for a lawyer to bring the proof that some input have been used by an algorithm to create an output. That means that maybe there will be thousands of infringement of music to create new outputs without control, since at some point lawyers and won't be allowed it and to sue the creation. And that was my point of view. So a big challenge for the next few years will be to have a solution, to have a kind of transparency and auditability of the artificial intelligence and of the algorithm, in order to know if whether or not some input have been used to create an output. So that was just think about that, but maybe Patrick would react afterwards on what I said. In order to go back to the French point of view on artificial intelligence based on copyright, I would like to say that I've participated to a commission linked to the Ministry of Culture, and I'm just a participant in that, and I'm not the one that have created and directed all the analysis. So it was directed by two French professors, notably Alexandra Ben-Samoun and Joël Farchi. And what has been discussed is very interesting, is how can we do and how can we react on copyright and artificial intelligence in the near future, in order at some point to preserve and to keep the speciality of copyright as itself and as it is in Europe. One of the particularity of copyright, is originality and the fact that copyright and work is directly linked to its author, which has to be a human. That's a main consideration. Another thing very important to say is that we can already, in fact, separate two different things. So we can separate artificial intelligence used as a tool, because we all use artificial intelligence as a tool. When we use software in order to create 3D, when we use in some way some music software, there is a slight solution or module that already contains some artificial intelligence, but they are just tools, and they're just tools that helps the creator to create real works. The real difficulty is on the works mentioned by Patrick, for instance, on the works for which you will use some input and you will create a new work by itself. So it means that we will be in a way that there will be no at some point no creator, no author behind the work. The work will have been created by an algorithm itself by pushing a button, for instance. And that's the main difficulty, because we don't know how to react with this work, since, as I mentioned, the real threat is to protect the originality and the concept of copyright itself. If we go and if we consider that this kind of works, so the artificial intelligence generated work are copyrightable, that will mean that we will kill the link between the human being and the creation itself. And this link is, in fact, the center of the principle of copyright in Europe and I would say in all the world, thanks to the Berne Convention. So that's very a big thing. For you to know, on October 2020, so last month, the European Parliament has issued some proposal in direction of the European Commission in order to express, in fact, and to think about a new legislation and new regulation on copyright. And what is very interesting is that in one of the considerants, they say that it should be considered that the works autonomously produced by artificial agents and robots might not be eligible for copyright protection in order to observe the principle of originality, which is linked to a natural person. So that means that the European Parliament, has already, in fact, taken a strong position on that, saying that they would like, if we talk about originality, that it will still be linked with a human being. So that's very important. And that's directly linked with what the work we have made in our report, because at some point, if you consider this position of originality, which is very important, you are stuck and you can't give to an autonomous creation by artificial intelligence any right. So that would mean at some point that if you use the principle of copyright and originality, any autonomous creation by artificial intelligence will not be protected. And that, in fact, is not the best solution either, because that would mean that if you do not allow to this kind of creation, pseudo creation, artificial creation, to be protected, that would mean that at some point there will be no investment in this field. So the real question is, what is the best way at some point to protect the originality of copyright as it is right now, and also to create a new regime to protect the autonomous creation of some work. And in our report, there is two big way to protect that. The first way is that in French we have a special regime on œuvre posthume. So it's posthumous. It's works that have been released after the death of the author. It's a special regime where, since the work has been discovered and was not known before, even if it is not copyrightable anyway, because it is it's over and the author is dead more than 70 years ago, it is protectable because they create like a neighbor right. It's like that to protect from the release of this new work. So it is a way maybe to think about that. So to totally separate it from copyright, maybe to think a regime like that, and maybe to protect the ones that have released the work by itself, even if it's work created by artificial intelligence. That's a way. Another way would be probably to create a special right. So it is exactly what has been made for the database. So it is we call that in France droit sui generis. It's from the Latin. So it's a special right, and the main thing about this special right is that it is mainly a right that would be here to protect the investment in artificial intelligence. For instance, you can consider that many, and it has already started. Many companies that are in the news area are already creating and using artificial intelligence in order to summarize some actuality. So that they create articles thanks to robots, that looks like articles written by human being, and because of that, they publish these articles over the net in order to give some information. If we consider that this could not be protected by artificial intelligence, that would mean that this newspaper could not protect these articles, and that anybody could copy them and publish them. And that's maybe an issue because they have heavily invested in tools that are that allows them to create this kind of articles. That's why a solution would be to create a special right that is not linked anymore to copyright and to originality, but is just linked to a kind of investment, and where the ones that have invested in the creation of some artificial intelligence works could be protected as soon as he is able to prove that he has made this investment and that he could use this creation as in a commercial way in order to sell them. So that's the best, the big proposals that are made in this article, and that is also linked with what I told you before about the European Parliament. Because if we consider that they already say that it could not affect the creation of copyright linked with the problem of originality, at some point it means that the only way would be, in fact, whether not to protect anything or whether to create a special right. And I'm pretty convinced that regarding the orientation of the way we are working, we will definitely go to this investment. I don't know if I'm okay with time or because I think I'm
okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Now we have a few minutes left for a round of questions. Let me comment that the issue of a creation of a special right, a sui generis right, it's quite difficult because it is difficult to identify who should be protected amongst the various people involved in the use of the artificial intelligence. There is the creator of the machine as such, of the software, of the algorithm. There is the a person who may, or the entity who may have made investments, resources or financial investments. There is maybe somebody who has actually used the machine, making some sort of creative or non-creative choices. So there are a number of legal person or natural persons possibly involved in this. But I think this is certainly something we will need to explore in the future. Now, let me ask you some questions from the public before we run out of time. I think there is a first question for Patrick mainly, which is what could be the consequences of this technological disruption for the future of artists and creativity?
Am I off mute? Yeah, good. Well, I mean, I think obviously it's impossible to say, but I think what we do know is that artists are at the heart of everything, you know, the record company does with producing music. You know, people attach, you know, to music, but they also attach to the artists themselves. I don't think, you know, the idea that robots are going to come in and replace artists is, you know, is a viable idea. However, you know, having said that, we need to ensure, as I think I was saying, you know, in my presentation, that the developments in AI sit alongside and in collaboration with creativity, with adequate copyright protection. There is no need for the protection of producers, of artists, of authors, of publishers to be diminished to make way for AI, as it were. I think the two can sit together very nicely, and we just need to be cautious that we are mindful of the value of music today, of the value of the artist, of the value of the producer who works with the artist, who invests in the artist and in the process.
Thank you, Patrick. Then we have another question from Barry Scannell. Very interesting question. I will try to summarize. Basically, he asks whether it is sufficient, the current licensing framework, to license musical work for the use in artificial intelligence, or whether there would be the need of a sui generis copyright to facilitate licensing in this field. Who wants to take the lead? Patrick, Georgie?
Well, from the licensing side, obviously what we're dealing with at present is, recordings that are either protected by copyright or related rights, and the underlying compositions and lyrics that are protected by copyright. Those are licensable under the existing framework, right? We don't need to make any changes at all. And I think, the enormous, variety of, digital licensing that has gone on in the past decades illustrates the flexibility of the existing system. So I wouldn't see any changes necessary at all to enable licensing.
Well, probably, as you said, Patrick, it would be necessary to slightly review the agreements to include further obligation to better control the usage of the works and derivative works. But yes, I agree that probably there is no need to create a sui generis rights for the licensing of existing recording. Then we have a final question again for Patrick from Diego Santin, who says, some artificial intelligence music technologies do not use rights protected songs as input, but the artificial intelligence engine is manually trained by humans. What are your thoughts about how to deal with the copyright of this type of artificial intelligence generated music and its application, synchronization with videos or TV commercial? So a situation in which there is no ingestion of prior recording, but training by...
I think that slightly goes back to the point that both you and Georgie have touched on, which is distinguishing between a purely automated AI process that ingests material, acts within the parameters set for it, and within the terrain of the material that it's being provided with, and output something. And the example that I think is being put forward by the person who's posed that question, which is AI being used as a tool by humans. And AI is used as a tool by humans, and in fact, artists have long used things like synthesizers to augment the process and or diversify what they're doing in a creative sense. But a use of a process as a tool doesn't take away from the fact that the human is at the center of that creativity. And I think the existing rules, flexible enough for the courts to say, well, actually, is there a human there or isn't there? So I think probably the framework as it stands can address those issues.
Yeah. Well, yes, the issue is always, I think, to find, at least from the copyright point of view, to find the natural person and the act of creativity, because not all the activities could be considered as creative. So, we do not want to find ourselves in a situation in which the human is carrying out simple and repetitive actions while creativity is done by the artificial intelligence. I think this is the kind of results we wouldn't like to have. So the point is try and finding a way to promote artificial intelligence, because this is necessary, keeping it whenever possible as a tool, and when this is not possible, in any event, promote either the natural person behind it or, as Georgie correctly said, the investment. Now I think we are almost, we still have 2 minutes to go, so we can go with our last question, which is a tricky one, I think, and is that different jurisdictions are approaching artificial intelligence in different ways. For instance, in the US, the fair use exception is already approaching artificial intelligence in a different way vis-a-vis the European system, which is based on exception and their interpretation, which is restrictive. And then there are also the Asian markets, China, Japan, South Korea, which are even more aggressive. And as we discussed, in some instances, they have even recognized some sort of rights to robot and such. Like, I mean, it is possible to consider to give a kind of subjectivity to robots. So do you think that different legislation, different approach amongst the various jurisdictions can have an impact on the development of artificial intelligence and all the cultural industry using it or in any way involved by artificial intelligence, and how this could have an impact on the music industry, for Patrick especially? But I would like maybe Georgie to take the lead now.
Yeah. Maybe in a few words. Yeah, I definitely think that there will be a competition between jurisdictions, and that's maybe I would make a parallel with the GDPR. Maybe that the Europe and the European Union would be in the lead for this kind of question, as we can see in the European Parliament on the regulation of that. We all know that the European Union likes to do regulations, but since because the copyright has been created in Europe, in France, and it is, I think, maybe a way to balance the problematic with the GAFAs. And as you may also know, there is currently a discussion about the Digital Services Act in Europe that will take in some way a question of competition in order to control at some point the GAFAs. And all this will be totally, I think, linked. And that's the question about artificial intelligence and copyright will be a question treated by European Commission.
Thank you. Patrick, do you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. I mean, very, very briefly. I mean, first of all, take the US. Fine, they have fair use. It's definitely not the case that fair use applies to any use of protected subject matter in AI. There is, so many different types of AI use. So, we don't know yet how that might or might not be applied. But if I understand the question, it's does deregulation or sympathetic regulation attract investment? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But what we have seen in the music industry, for example, is that take Spotify, which was out of the door very early on in the streaming market and has grown so much. That was developed in a market that has very solid levels of copyright protection and European regulation and the rest of it. So I don't think that if I understand the question, that light touch regulation and giving developers sort of free rein necessarily is going to be the thing that stimulates investment. If anything, it's legal certainty, and everyone benefits from that.
Well, thank you. We have to close. Thank you very much for your interesting speeches.
Thank
I
you.
hope the panel was interesting for the public. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.